And a glorious good evening to each and every one of you. As usual, I want to start off by saying never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world because indeed that is the only thing that ever has. And I thank you, Margaret Mead, for putting that message out there, and I'm going to keep the ball rolling. That being said, before I get started, just a couple of seconds. I wore this shirt for the woman who, in Utah, who couldn't find a person of color to blame Charlie Kirk's shooting on. So she blamed it on the Democrats. Uh, that being said, news people, you're getting on air too much saying that you don't know how we got to where we are. Now, I'm not the swiftest deer in the forest. I'm not. But you know exactly why this climate is how it is. It's because it's been drummed in our heads since Trump's first run for office. And by virtue of your covering him and repeating the rhetoric, that's how this stuff is getting spread. It's on again. Call it like you see it. We need some truth on air. Now, Fox is already sold out. We know that. Channel 9 jumped on that bandwagon. Very disappointed, but it is what it is. People do what they do. Money moves like it moves. But be smart enough to read and research. Just be that smart. So that being said, let's jump on into chapter 11 of a book that you need to get in your library. Black AF History. Chapter 11. So devilish fire. The black women who started the civil rights movement. And this chapter begins with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. Civilization must show two things: the glory and the beauty of creating life, and the need and duty of power and intelligence. This and this only will make the perfect marriage of love and work. But what of black women? The world that wills to worship womankind studiously forgets its darker sisters. I most sincerely doubt if any other race of women could have brought its fineness up through so devilish a fire. The history of Black America begins with Angela and ends with her and ends with your mama. Between those two pillars lies all that this country is or ever will be. When discussing the struggle of liberation and freedom, historians often date the campaign commonly known as the Civil Rights Movement from the 1955 death of Emmett Till until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. This overly broad description of the 4-century effort to get free is usually confined to a list of names such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Jackie Robinson, painting a picture as if black people woke up in 1955 and discovered that they were oppressed. However, black women's impact in politics, culture, and the collective reimagining of a free Black America formed the foundation of the modern civil rights movement. Even though they were doubly disenfranchised and marginalized by society, their impact was inversely proportionate to their social status. They were perhaps society's most underappreciated and discounted population. Yet when it came to fighting for equality, they were arguably the most influential group in the country. It would be impossible to fully document Black women's contributions to this country, but to understand how Black people have not been consumed by the white hot heat of America's flames, you must first understand the women who have shielded Black America from this forever raging inferno. The first was Mary Church Terrell. Mary Elizabeth Church was born in Memphis on September 23, 1863, to two recently emancipated slaves, Robert Reed Church and Louisa Ayres Church. When Mary was 11, her parents sent her to Oberlin, Ohio, to attend Oberlin Public School, which also allowed her to escape the yellow fever epidemic that ravaged Memphis in 1878. Meanwhile, Robert spent his time purchasing the devalued property of deceased yellow fever victims and parlaying it into a real estate empire. When Mary returned to Memphis in 1879, the city had transformed. Her father opened restaurants, saloons, and state-of-the-art hotels that profited from the city's segregation laws, even using his immense wealth to open a bank that loaned money to Black residents. He transformed Memphis into one of the rare places where segregated facilities for Blacks were equal to, and sometimes better than, those that accommodated whites. Robert Church had become the South's only African American millionaire. That was first. Meanwhile, Mary's mother, Louisa, had an idea. She opened a posh beauty parlor that catered to Memphis's elite white women. That was also a first. When Mary was 17 years old, she graduated from high school and became one of the first Black women accepted into Oberlin College. As the first college in America to accept women, Oberlin created a course of study for female students that allowed them to graduate in 2 years. Mary said, nah, choosing the gentleman's path that required 4 years of study, including learning to speak Greek. While there, she formed a tight clique of besties that included Anna Julia Cooper, the fourth Black woman in America to earn a PhD, and Ida Gibbs, who co-founded the first YWCA for Black women. After graduation, Mary earned her master's degree in education. That was another first, and began teaching modern languages at the historically Black Wilberforce University before moving to Europe to study, becoming fluent in French, German, and Italian. After she returned to the States, Oberlin offered her a job as the registrar, which would have made her the first Black woman to hold that position. But Mary wasn't interested in sharing her talent to help white institutions prosper. Instead, she went to teach Latin at the infamous M Street School in Washington, D.C., later renamed Paul Dunbar High School. As soon as she got the job, the faculty at M Street set about trying to hook Mary up with one of their fellow teachers, Robert Terrell. It worked. Church eventually married Terrell, resigned her teaching post, and was named superintendent of the school. After her wedding, Terrell briefly considered leaving public life as an activist and educator. She was ready to focus on raising a family and engaging in community social work until one of her longtime friends, Thomas Moss, the postman and owner of the People's Grocery in Memphis, was killed by a lynch mob. Terrell immediately joined her homegirl, Ida B. Wells, in the fight for anti-lynching laws, writing an article entitled, quote, Lynching from a Negro's Point of View, end quote, in 1904. Now, like Wells, Church became a prolific columnist and chronicler of Black life, always pushing for gender equality and civil rights. During a trip to the White House, the two pleaded for President Benjamin Harrison to address the lynching epidemic in his State of the Union speech, but that was to no avail. Fortunately, Terrell's mentor convinced her that her talents were too immense for her to leave public life. After all, when your mentor is Frederick Douglass, you do whatever he says. When Terrell was asked to speak at the 1904 International Congress of Women in Berlin, again another first, she gave the speech in German. Then she delivered it in French. Then she did it again in English. A staunch suffragist, Terrell confounded the National Association of Colored Women, and she was a member of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and along with Ida B. Wells, was one of the two Black women listed as founders of the NAACP. She penned numerous op-eds for the most important newspapers, both black and white, but did so under the pen name Euphemia Kirk. Terrell often used her platform to share Wells's research to dispel the myth that lynching laws stopped Black men from becoming uncontrollable rapists. With one breath, these spokesmen with one breath, these spokesmen for the South admit that during the war, when the men of that section, generally speaking, were on the battlefield fighting to keep the iron heel of oppression upon the neck of themselves, the dusky bondsmen left behind on the plantations protected the mothers, daughters, and wives of their masters with a tenderness, a fidelity, and sacredness of trust which the men of no race have ever surpassed. With the next breath, they insist that these men and their descendants have changed so radically in sentiment and conduct as to have become sexual degenerates and brutes, unable to control their passion for white women and unwilling to bridle their low desires. That was both Terrell and Ida B. Wells. If Terrell had dared address the historic fantasy of the sexually insatiable Black savage in modern times, they would have undoubtedly accused her of being a critical race theorist. In a lifetime of incredible achievements, perhaps Terrell's most significant contribution to the movement occurred when she was 87 years old. As one of America's most prominent Black women, she was named chair and spokesman of the Coordinating Committee for the Enforcement of the D.C. Anti-Discrimination Laws, a group that pledged to fight segregation in the nation's capital. Before Terrell and her friends met at Thompson's cafeteria on January 27, 1950, researchers at Howard University Law School had informed the committee that the district had outlawed segregation in 1872, but it was never enforced. The manager greeted the party and informed them that they didn't serve coloreds. Do you mean to tell me that you're not going to serve me? Terrell asked. When the manager confirmed that they were when the manager confirmed that they were so racist they didn't even want Black people's money, an argument ensued. Terrell and her friends on the committee later returned to the restaurant to gather more information and were kicked out again. So the city filed a suit against the restaurant on their behalf. 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled in District of Columbia versus John R. Thompson Company that segregation was indeed against the law in the nation's capital, desegregating the city forever. By being kicked out of the restaurant, Mary Church Terrell kicked open the doors to equality. Next is Mary Ellen Pleasant, undercover billionaire. And folks, please tell your children to research these folks and write their Black History reports in February on some of these folks, because we need to know who they are so we can know whose we are. Mary Ellen Pleasant, undercover billionaire. When abolitionist John Brown was hanged for treason for attempting a violent overthrow of the institution of slavery, there was a signed note in his pocket that read, quote, "The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money to help. WEP," end quote. Army investigators desperately tried to find out who was responsible for aiding the armed insurrection, thinking it was a wealthy Northern abolitionist. They focused on the initials signed on the note, but they were reading them upside down. It turns out the note was written by one of the wealthiest and smartest Black women in American history. Mary Ellen Pleasant was born around 1814, but because her life is surrounded by mystery, no one really knows where. Sometimes she claimed to have been born free. Sometimes she claimed she was born in slavery and purchased her freedom, while other times she said that she was a child of a voodoo priestess from the Caribbean. In any case, she wound up in Nantucket Island as a child, working as an indentured servant for a family of abolitionists. She never received a formal education, but said she, quote, studied men and women a good deal, end quote, which may be how she married a wealthy Massachusetts business owner of Cuban descent, James Smith. Smith was a complicated figure. Known to be an abusive man, he was also a staunch abolitionist. He died after 4 years of marriage, leaving Mary tens of thousands of dollars to fund her career as a slave stealer on the Underground Railroad. While hanging out with the abolitionists on Nantucket, Mary met and married John James Pleasant in 1848. Her new husband worked as a cook on a whaling ship, which enabled them to transport escaped slaves to Nova Scotia's black communities. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it too dangerous for Mary to continue her work, Mary and her husband moved to San Francisco just in time for the California gold rush, but not before stopping in New Orleans so Mary could take voodoo lessons from the infamous voodoo queen Marie Laveau. During her Louisiana stay, Mary and her husband arranged for escaped slaves to travel to California. When Mary arrived in San Francisco with a reported $15,000 in gold coins, she took a job as a domestic servant, even though she was worth nearly a $500,000 in today's currency. Because the value of gold was at an all-time high, she exchanged her gold for silver, deposited the silver in the bank, and took out the money, $1,000 at a time. Now, passing for white, Mary told the wealthy white men that she knew of a speculator who could loan money at a 10% interest rate. She used her position to eavesdrop on financial advice and, with the help of Thomas Bell, who worked at a local bank, invested in laundries, utility companies, brothels, and a string of boarding houses. Her husband, meanwhile, continued to work at sea during the couple's 30-year marriage. Pleasant was one of the first investors in oil and ended up owning so much land and real estate that California's governor took the oath of office in one of her boarding houses. She used cunning instincts, blackmail, and her exotic looks to control the most powerful men in the city, writing in her unfinished autobiography that she was a girl full of smartness who let books alone and instead focused on learning how to influence people. Because women weren't allowed to bank, she paid Bell handsomely to keep her deposits in his name. By 1875, Bell and Pleasant had made $30 million, nearly $1 billion in today's currency. Although she passed for white in the community at large, she didn't hide her race from her black beneficiaries, explaining that she was the child of a Hawaiian and a full-blooded Louisiana negress. As soon as the 14th Amendment was signed, she officially changed her race to black and began funding civil rights cases. Luckily, she faced little discrimination, partly because she used her connections and relationships to keep extensive records on the wealthy men who patronized her brothels, as well as detailed accounts of their illegitimate children and backroom political dealings. Pleasant reportedly even arranged marriages between wealthy men and young women who she called her proteges. In San Francisco, Pleasant earned the nickname, quote, the Harriet Tubman of California, end quote, funding the Underground Railroad and helping self-emancipated slaves to resettle, hiring them at her numerous restaurants, boarding houses, and horse stables. She was known to be a one-woman social agency in California, providing relief for dozens of black families. In 1858, Archie Lee, an enslaved man whose owner had brought him from Mississippi to California, escaped and declared himself free. Now, although California was a free state, Archie lost because, as a black man, his testimony wasn't allowed in court. Mary paid for his legal fees and housing and worked to change the law that barred African Americans from testifying in court. By the time the case wound up in the Federal Court of Appeals, the law was overturned and Lee was declared a free man. In 1866, Pleasant filed a lawsuit against two companies after streetcar operators refused to let her ride. She withdrew one lawsuit when the Omnibus Railroad Company agreed to allow African Americans on their cars. The second case, Pleasant versus North Beach and Mission Railroad Company, outlawed segregation on San Francisco public transportation forever. Pleasant died in 1904 after most of her resources were depleted by the widow of Thomas Bell, who claimed that Pleasant's money belonged to Bell. She still had her investments in property, but had spent much of her cash helping others. She spent her last years in a 30-room mansion that spanned 6 blocks. Her underground activities were never known to whites until she dictated her autobiography and revealed her secrets, including the greatest one of all. Quote, "Before I pass away," she confessed, "I wish to clear the identity of the party who furnished John Brown and most of the money to start the fight at Harper's Ferry, and who signed the letter found on him when he was arrested." Mary's hate for inequality and love for her people were the sparks that fueled her life. Here was a colored woman who became one of the shrewdest business minds in the state. She anticipated the development in oil. She was the trusted confidant of many of the California pioneers, and for years was a power in San Francisco affairs, Du Bois said of Pleasant. Yet she held her memories, her hatreds, her deep designs, and throughout a life that was perhaps more than unconventional, she treasured a bitter hatred for slavery. Amazingly, she managed to overcome every hurdle American society placed before her without losing her humanity or compromising her beliefs. You see, folks, it is not impossible. The next woman was Callie Guy House, who said, "Check, please." The idea of reparations is not a new idea, nor has it ever been controversial until recently. After the Civil War, legislators, activists, and anyone with common sense attempted various forms of compensation for formerly enslaved African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau was an acknowledgement of this sentiment, as was the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which offered free land to ex-slaves. Perhaps the most common proposal to create some form of economic security for ex-slaves was the Freedmen's Pension. Within the African American community, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association quickly became the most popular grassroots effort to push the idea of compensation for former slaves. At the organization's first national conference in Nashville on November 28, 1898, the body elected Callie Guy House, a local washerwoman, as their assistant secretary. Although the title might not seem impressive, House used her position to chart the course for the organization's future. She organized meetings in any place where white people weren't around. She visited churches. She contacted lawmakers. She talked to black newspapers. She formed chapters and trained agents in states across the South. Taking inspiration directly from the government's pension structure for Civil War veterans, House created an organization so powerful that legislators were forced to listen to the group's demands. Between 1890 In 1903, 6 bills were introduced in Congress offering a lump sum followed by monthly payments to Black Americans who had outlasted slavery. But after Southern Democrats regained reputation in the federal legislature, anything that offered economic or political support for Black America was dead on arrival. After all, if they couldn't pass a law that made lynching illegal, reparations were a long shot. But they kept trying. In 1915, the association filed a class action lawsuit, Johnson versus McAdoo, in federal court for over $68 million, demanding the return of cotton taxes collected by the Treasury Department between 1862 and 1868. According to the suit, the money was due to former slaves and their ancestors for their unpaid labor. The suit eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which claimed that the Treasury Department had governmental immunity because slavery was constitutional. In 1916, House was indicted for mail fraud on the grounds that she had sent bogus flyers through the mail. According to prosecutors, House had been soliciting donations from ex-slaves by falsely claiming that pensions had been secured for the ex-slaved. Without evidence that House or any member of the organization had guaranteed or misled anyone to believe they would receive a pension, she was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to a year in prison. During her trial, prosecutors revealed that intelligence officers from three different bureaus, the United States Post Office, the Justice Department, and the Pension Bureau, had been tracking House and the MRB and PA for years. Federal agents estimated that the group had 300,000 members organizing in churches, fraternities, sororities, and poor communities across the country. But some researchers, including historian Mary France Berry, believe the government's estimate may be on the low end. For comparison, in 1919, the NAACP had 90,000 members. In less than 20 years, a 36-year-old Tennessee washerwoman had organized the largest Black grassroots organization America had ever seen. The National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association would dissolve after House's imprisonment, but the reparations movement that she championed would never die. Next, we have Ella Baker, bigger than a hamburger. As a storyteller, I sometimes have to restrain myself from using hyperbole to point out the importance of certain historical events or figures. However, in this particular case, I am not faced with that problem. If one were to make a list of the most famous figures of the civil rights movement, and that would be including Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the rest of the names that white people know, one humbly modest statement encapsulates the life of Ella Josephine Baker. She is more important than all those guys. Born in 1903, in 1930, Ella joined the Young Negroes Cooperative League to promote and teach Black economic power. She was protesting Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and fighting the unjust conviction of the Scottsboro Boys before Martin Luther King could even describe his dreams. She was named the NAACP's Director of Branches in 1943, and in 1952, she became the first female president of the New York City chapter. Ella Baker was instrumental in founding every major civil rights organization during the 1950s and 60s. In 1957, after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, she moved to Atlanta to help form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was Baker's management and ideas that formed the framework of the organization's efforts. However, the group's patriarchal leader, Martin Luther King Jr., blocked her from public leadership roles. 3 years later, Baker was growing tired of the sexism of the ministers in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when she heard about the explosion of small sit ins popping up across North Carolina. Knowing young people were the key to forming a more democratic movement, she invited students to a meeting at her alma mater, Shaw University. She convinced King to co sign the invite and use up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's funds to finance the conference. The audience was filled with 126 delegates from 58 sit in centers in 12 states, who would become known as the faces of the civil rights movement, including future Congressman and freedom rider John Lewis, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry, and the infamous Black Power champion Stokely Carmichael. As always, the meeting was dominated by male leaders, but this time it was Baker's turn to talk. After King spoke about adopting nonviolence and the need for strong leadership, Baker stood up and gave a speech entitled, quote, "Bigger than a hamburger," end quote. She fired the students up by telling them to forget what had just been said and instead to move toward more radical action, explaining that a youth-oriented grassroots movement that was more democratic and leaderless could achieve more than just a few integrated lunch counters. I can remember her warning against entanglements with adults, civil rights leader Julian Bond explained. But just to keep our movement pure, that we had started it, we had carried it forward, and we could carry it on by ourselves. She didn't say, "Don't let Martin Luther King tell you what to do," but you got the real feeling that that's what she meant, you know? He's a good man and so on, but don't let him tell you what to do. Thus began the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, one of the most effective bodies in the freedom struggle. After the meeting, Baker resigned from King's SCLC and became one of SNCC's most trusted advisors. She convinced the new group to form two distinct wings, one using nonviolent direct action and one organizing voting and political strategies. She helped build a partnership with the Congress on Racial Equality and helped to coordinate the Freedom Rides. She was a key figure in organizing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which offered an alternative to the all-white Democratic Party in that state. She accompanied the group that forced the Democratic Party to seat Black delegates at its national convention. She rejected the Masonic traditional male leadership role that promoted a participatory democracy. The results of her actions influenced organizers throughout the country, recasting the desperate fights for equality as one unified civil rights movement. In the 1940s, during her time as the NAACP leader, Ella Baker helped organize leadership training sessions for young people interested in community activism. One of her youngest workshop participants would eventually rise to become secretary of her local NAACP chapter. Inspired by Baker, a young woman named Rosa Parks volunteered for a project that required her to sit down on a Montgomery bus and say, "Nah, I'm good." Ella Baker's battle plans were as important as the foot soldiers who stood on the front lines in the fight for equality and civil rights. Yet, because she was a victim of the inequality she fought against, her name is not as well known as those of her contemporaries. Perhaps she would be more famous if she had someone like Ella Baker to champion her cause. Then again, there's only one Ella Baker. The next woman, Amelia Boynton. Amelia Boynton will be there. Amelia Boynton was everywhere In 1961, when civil rights advocates began the early push to expand voting rights in Dallas County, Alabama, a number of different strategies were brought to the table. First, they needed to know how many black people were in Selma and the surrounding areas who had been disenfranchised. Knowing that children might not be suspected of subverting the Jim Crow laws, local activist Amelia Boynton had already organized kids in Dallas County to go door to door handing out surveys, concluding that of the 15,000 voting age black residents, just 242 were registered to vote. Because Alabama forced black voters to prove their ability to read and knowledge of the Constitution, activists also needed to educate black residents on how to pass the literacy test required to volunteer. Required to register to vote. Amelia Boynton had started to charge. On, excuse me, y'all. Amelia Boynton had started the charge on that way back in 1935, teaching classes about how to pass the racist test after she became one of the first black folks in the state to do so. Amelia Boynton was a trailblazer, and now she was getting key support from the movement. By 1965, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and every major civil rights activist in America were sitting in Amelia Boynton's living room, planning to overthrow Jim Crow in Selma, Alabama. Born in 1911, Boynton attended Georgia State Industrial College, now Savannah State University, before transferring to the Tuskegee Institute, where she hung out with George Washington Carver, even naming a son after him, and earned a degree in home economics. As a U.S. Department of Agriculture home demonstration agent, she spent years traveling across rural Alabama teaching blacks about homemaking, nutrition, and navigating rural life. In southern communities like Selma, there is often one community leader who serves the black population's business needs. Some of the more common professions for this community leader include insurance agent, funeral director, and postal employee. But the one thing they usually have in common is that they are notary publics. So when the Ku Klux Klan ran the town's only black notary public out of town, making it impossible to register to vote, Amelia convinced her husband to start an insurance agency, become a notary, and take over the organization the man had started, the Dallas County Voters League. After she and Samuel acquired a building in downtown Selma, the couple held NAACP meetings in their tiny office, fighting the Klan, the state and local governments, and the notoriously racist local sheriff, Jim Clark. And she even fought hand to hand. When a well-known racist attacked the Boyntons in their downtown office in 1954, she grabbed a stick and stood right there, demonstrating the ancient African tradition of wishing, an MF would. In 1958, a young Howard Law School student was riding the bus to Selma for Christmas break when the bus stopped at a Trailways bus station in Virginia to allow the passengers to eat. Bruce, the law student, posted up at the whites only counter just like everyone else. When authorities told him to leave, Bruce wouldn't budge. He was arrested and convicted, but he wouldn't stop until his conviction was overturned. His mother called an NAACP lawyer she knew and made that friend promise to fight for her son, even if they had to go to the Supreme Court. Those cops had no idea that Bruce Boynton's mother was infamous organizer Amelia Boynton, and that lawyer Powell was none other than Thurgood Marshall. The landmark Supreme Court case of Bruce George Washington Carver Boynton versus Virginia overturned segregation on interstate commerce, changing the course of history forever. Shortly thereafter, Young, act, young activists Ralph Abernathy, Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, and others gained prominence on the Freedom Rides, a joint effort by CORE and SNCC to enforce Boynton versus Virginia. By 1964, Amelia had given up her leadership position to run for Congress, making her the first Black woman in the state of Alabama to run for Congress and the first woman of any race to run as a Democrat. After she lost, she didn't stop fighting for justice. She became even more deeply invested in the cause after Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old Black deacon, was beaten, shot, and killed by Alabama state troopers during a peaceful protest on February 18, 1965. Boynton rejoined the DCBL and invited the most prominent civil rights leaders of the time to the tiny town of Selma. While many of the league's members were dubious that any of them would show up, Amelia was there in her living room with Martin Luther King Jr. and James Bevel, along with organizers from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, planning how to defeat segregation. Therefore, they organized a march to the state capitol in Montgomery to talk to Governor George Wallace about Jackson's death. But of course, Wallace dispatched his club-toting troopers to the march that became known as Bloody Sunday. When officers cracked John Lewis's skull on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the demonstration, Amelia did not run. The viral picture of the protest was a photo of Amelia Boynton being gassed and beaten by police officers. That was one of the photos that turned public sentiment and convinced President Lyndon Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act. One of the coolest stories about Amelia Boynton's life was discovered only recently. For years, historians believed Cudjo Lewis, who was immortalized in writer Zora Neale Hurston's posthumous bestseller, Barracoon, was the last living survivor of the slave trade. In 1860, Timothy Meagher, a wealthy Mobile, Alabama plantation owner, made a bet with his friends that he could sneak a shipment of slaves into the country. 52 years after the importation of human chattel was outlawed in the United States, the Clotilda, a two-masted schooner, snuck into Mobile Bay, returning from a secret mission in Benin, Africa. Captained by William Foster, the Clotilda unloaded its precious cargo, around 112 kidnapped human beings. To hide their misdeeds, Foster rushed to the Clotilda and set it on fire. The vessel sank to the bottom. The stolen Africans were eventually sold and worked as slaves until they were emancipated in 1865. When they were denied reparations, Lewis and a group of slaves put their money together and founded the African-centered town of Africatown, located a few miles from Mobile. In 2019, a British researcher discovered archival footage of Ridoshi, a formerly enslaved woman who was sold to forced labor camp owner Washington Smith in Dallas County, Alabama. Ridoshi lived 2 years longer than Cudjo Lewis and was even active during the infancy of the civil rights movement. And the story of how this archival footage emerged? One day, a USDA agent named Amelia Boynton visited Ridoshi on her rural farm and began listening to the stories of her capture, enslavement, and emancipation. Excited, Boynton convinced the Department of Agriculture to bring a film crew out to Aunt Sally's farm and interviewed her about her experiences. Thus, Amelia Boynton's influence spans from the transatlantic slave trade to this very moment. Amelia Boynton was always there. and she still is. The women who desegregated the Montgomery buses. Claudette Colvin was mad. On March 2nd, 1955, the outspoken 15-year-old high school student stepped onto a Montgomery City bus. Because Colvin's family didn't own a car, she took the Capitol Heights bus home from school every day. She was already sitting in the colored section when the driver, Robert Clare, demanded that she and three friends give their seats to white women who were standing up. Colvin thought about the paper on the unfair practices of segregation that she had just turned in to her teacher. She thought about how she couldn't even try on clothes at local department stores lest she sully the items with her black skin. But most of all, she thought about her friend Jeremiah. Jeremiah Reeves was so good looking and cool. All the girls at Booker T. Washington High School had a crush on him. He played in the school's jazz band, and he already had a job delivering groceries to white neighborhoods. In 1952, the white residents in one Montgomery neighborhood confirmed their suspicions that Reeves was having an affair with a white woman when they peeked in a window and saw the couple undressing. The woman, however, claimed that Reeves was raping her. Police arrested Reeves, took him to a nearby prison, and strapped him into the electric chair for 2 days until he finally confessed. Because Montgomery's black citizens were not allowed to vote, an all-white jury sentenced Reeves to death. This is what radicalized Claudette Colvin. When police officers dragged her off the bus and took her to jail, she had already joined the NAACP's youth council. As the cops made jokes about her bra size and body parts, Colvin screamed about her constitutional rights. She felt the echoes of injustice and the touch of her ancestors. History kept me stuck to my seat, Colvin would say later. I felt the hand of Harriet Tubman pushing down on one of my shoulders, and Sojourner Truth pushing down on the other. Aurelia Browder would be next. A widower with 6 children, Browder didn't complete her high school education until she was in her 30s. She later enrolled at Alabama State University, where she met Joanne Gibson Robinson, a professor in the English department. Robinson inspired Browder to get involved in the civil rights movement, and on April 19, 1955, Browder was arrested for sitting in the white section of a Montgomery bus. She would later graduate from Alabama State with honors, earning a bachelor's degree in science. Susie McDonald, known around Montgomery as Miss Sue, owned a pavilion in the city where black residents could gather without fear of racial intimidation. When Miss Sue was arrested for violating Montgomery's bus rules on October 21, 1955, she was in her 70s and she could pass for white. McDonald, however, had made sure to inform the driver that she was indeed a black woman before she sat down. That same day, 18-year-old Mary Louise Smith was arrested for sitting in the whites-only section. Janetta Reese was arrested for the same offense. And finally, on Thursday, December the 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks did it too. Unlike Colvin, Browder, McDonald, Smith, and Reese, Parks planned her protest. She served as secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and had participated in civil rights activism for more than a decade. Part of the reason Rosa was selected to publicize the injustice of segregation was because of her presentation. The leaders had already rejected Claudette Colvin because she was dark-skinned and outspoken and was pregnant and unmarried. Parks, on the other hand, was fair-skinned, reserved, and had, quote, good hair, end quote. When Professor Robinson heard about Parks' arrest, she was fed up. After her prize student, Browder, had been arrested for the same thing, Robinson tried to convince her organization, the Women's Political Council, to organize a citywide bus boycott. Robinson called a few students and colleagues at Alabama State, and they printed 35,000 flyers calling for a one-day citywide boycott and passed them out at local churches. Another woman has been arrested and thrown in jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down, read the typewritten flyer. It is the second time since the Claudette Colvin case that a Negro woman has been arrested for the same thing. This has to be stopped. Okay. Sorry, y'all lost my place. Okay. Another woman, I'm going to read it again. Another woman has been arrested and thrown in jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down, read the typewritten flyer. It is the second time since the Claudette Colvin case that a Negro woman has been arrested for the same thing. This has to be stopped. Negroes have rights too, for if Negroes did not ride the buses, they could not operate. 3/4 of the riders were Negro, yet we are arrested or have to stand over empty seats. If we do not do something to stop these arrests, they will continue. The next time it may be you, or your daughter, or even your mother. This woman's case will come up on Monday. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. You can afford to stay out of school for one day if you have no other way to go except by bus. You can also afford to stay out of town for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk. But please, children and grown-ups, don't ride the bus at all on Monday. Please stay off all buses Monday. On December 5th, 1955, a group of leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and asked Robinson to lead it. Robinson declined because of her job at Alabama State, so the next logical choice was E.D. Nixon. A thorn in a white Montgomery's side, Nixon had been organizing civil rights campaigns as early as 1940 and was the unelected mayor of Black Montgomery. Because the early civil rights movement was entrenched in sexism, Nixon and others wouldn't even consider a woman leader. Rosa Parks wasn't even allowed to speak at the meeting. Nixon suggested a younger face for the movement, nominating the new pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Unlike the women who stood up for their rights, King was reluctant. He wanted a more low-key position that would not upset the city's leadership. But after Nixon threatened to expose him as a coward, King accepted the role with a few conditions. As the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, King did not demand that the city integrate buses. The Montgomery Improvement Association called for a first come, first served seating, more African American drivers on predominantly Black routes, and courteous treatment of Black residents. The NAACP attorney Fred Gray decided to get involved. He tracked down Colvin, Crowder, McDonald, Reese, and Smith to file a civil rights lawsuit against the city. Reese eventually dropped out of the lawsuit because she was being harassed by whites in Montgomery, but Claudette, Aurelia, Miss Sue, and Mary were down. Gray won the case in the U.S. District Court, but the city appealed to the Supreme Court. On December 17, 1956, the Supreme Court rejected the city's appeal, affirming the district court's ruling in Aurelia S. Browder et al. Versus W.A. Gale et al. Segregation was unconstitutional on Montgomery City transportation, and on December 20, 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott ended. Next on the list is Mary McLeod Bethune, a military genius. Not far from the plantation where my ancestors were enslaved in Sumter and Lee counties in a Maysville, South Carolina, rice and cotton farm where Mary Jane McLeod was born. Everyone knows that Mary McLeod Bethune would eventually take $1.50 and create the Daytona Literary and Industrial Training School for Negro Girls, a historically black institution that later became Bethune-Cookman University. After becoming the first black woman to serve as a college president, she co-founded the United Negro College Fund, which has provided scholarships to more than 500,000 black students. During this time, she forged a friendship with President Franklin Roosevelt's wife and used her status as Eleanor Roosevelt's closest friend, and that was the closest friend in her age group, to push the president on his civil rights agenda. Now, let's be clear, regardless of whether he did it for political expediency or his own white supremacist leanings, Frankie D was a racist. He refused to support anti-lynching legislation. He nominated a Klansman to the Supreme Court. He interned American citizens in, he interred American citizens in concentration camps. And when he introduced his New Deal that made it rain billions on white America to lift the country out of the Great Depression, he largely excluded black citizens. But behind the scenes, Bethune was one of the few people who could speak to Franklin in the African American dialect known as keeping it real. She successfully used her influence with the First Lady to push for economic and political progress for Black America. Because he rarely came in contact with people of the Negro persuasion, Franklin D. Roosevelt thought Bethune was one of the smartest women who ever lived. As the director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, she convinced the president to set aside 300,000 public works jobs for the African Americans. In 1936, Roosevelt tapped Bethune to organize the Federal Council of Negro Affairs. Known as the, quote, Black Cabinet, end quote, the group of scholars, activists, and leaders wasn't an official government-sanctioned entity. They took no notes and usually gathered in Bethune's apartment or in her office as a back channel on policy for Black America. One of the group's first orders of business was to discuss recent union protests by union organizer Asa Philip Randolph, who was demanding an end to discrimination in defense industries. Because he was a socialist and a radical, Asa Philip Randolph wasn't a member of the Black Cabinet, but the Brain Trust knew the power and influence he wielded among the Black working class. The president was kind of preoccupied with this little thing called World War II, so he dismissed Randolph's threats for a large-scale protest in Washington until Bethune said, "Trust me, you want to listen to old boy." Roosevelt put the Black cabinet in charge of addressing the issue. Rayford Logan, a member of the council and a history professor from Howard University, drafted Executive Order 8802, declaring that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. The order also established the Fair Employment Practice Committee to enforce equality in the defense industry. With such a momentous victory under her belt, one would assume Bethune would leave well enough alone. But more can be done, she wrote in a letter to Roosevelt on November 27, 1939. One of the sorest points among Negroes which I have encountered is the flagrant discrimination against Negroes in all of the armed forces of the United States. Forthright action on your part to lessen discrimination and segregation, and particularly in affording opportunities for the training of Negro pilots for the Air Corps, would gain tremendous goodwill, perhaps even out of proportion to the significance of such an action. Bethune didn't just make the suggestion that Roosevelt introduce black pilots to the Army's newly created Air Force. She laid out a plan on how to get it done without ruffling feathers. Among the Army's top brass, black pilots flying airplanes was a ludicrous idea. There had not been an African American pilot in the history of the United States Armed Forces. And if you thought white people hated seeing uniformed blacks being treated as heroes after World War One, can you imagine how furious they would be about black pilots flying the most sophisticated aircraft in the world? Commanding General Henry Hap Arnold was in dire need of pilots, but admitted that a crew of African American airmen would result in Negro officers serving over white enlisted men, creating an impossible social situation. To quell the controversy, Arnold commissioned a report that concluded that because of Roosevelt's executive order, the Army couldn't turn away qualified black pilots. However, there were only 124 African American pilots in the entire country, and since the Army was segregated, there was no place to train them and no funds to build an entirely new training facility. Black leaders felt betrayed. The July 1940 cover of The Crisis explained the controversy perfectly. Quote, warplanes. Negro Americans may not build them, repair them, or fly them, but they must help pay for them, end quote. Bethune, however, was fine about the Army's decision because she had already found a solution for this inequity. Unbeknownst to most of America, Bethune had privately convinced the White House to tack a benign provision, Public Law Number 18, onto a military appropriation bill intended to prepare the nation's armed forces for war. The addendum included funds for black colleges that required the establishment of the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a non-military aviation program that found qualified civilians and trained them as pilots. Because the Civilian Pilot Training Program wasn't technically part of the military, the historically black colleges had been sending prospective pilots to train at the Tuskegee Institute, which used funds from Public Law 18 to recruit, test, and train black pilots using the exact same methods employed at nearby Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama. Still, they needed a platform to prove they were as good as the white boys. And naturally, Bethune had a literal ace up her sleeve. On March 29, 1941, Eleanor arrived at Tuskegee to attend a trustee meeting for the Rosenwald Fund, a charity that donated millions to black educational institutions, including Bethune-Cookman College. After her morning meetings, the First Lady took a day trip to Tuskegee's flight training site, where she met C. Alfred Chief Anderson, a black pilot. Ignoring the protest of her Secret Service officers, Eleanor asked Anderson to take her on a short flight. 40 minutes later, the First Lady told Anderson, well, you can fly all right. 4 months later, on July 19, 1941, the Army welcomed Class 42C, the U.S. military's first all-black class, to train as combat pilots. Even though Tuskegee had identified, trained, and qualified the black civilian pilots for flight school, the Army still resisted. Citing the military segregation policy, the top brass still insisted that there was no place to complete their military training. But this is where Bethune's seemingly innocuous plan came together. Remember Eleanor's meeting for the Rosenwald Fund? After her flight, the First Lady arranged for a loan to build Moton Field in Tuskegee, where the soldiers could complete their first phase of training. And because Randolph's Executive Order 8802 forbade discrimination in awarding defense contracts, Black-owned construction firm McKissick and McKissick won the contract to build a state-of-the-art training facility. Using a design by African American architect Hilliard Robinson, labor from 2,000 of those Black public works employees that Bethune had lobbied for, and the funds from Public Law 18, McKissick and McKissick completed Tuskegee Army Airfield in just 6 months, making it the only Army site that hosted three phases of pilot training: the basic, the advanced, and the transition, and it was at a single location. On June 11, 1943, German and Italian troops surrendered the Mediterranean island of Pantelleria. In the entire military history of the world, a land force had never been defeated by an air only assault until the very first mission of the 99th Pursuit Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Force, or as we call them, the Tuskegee Airmen. Mary McLeod Bethune's legacy extended into every section of Black life, in politics, education, economics, and social life. And all it took was wisdom, courage, intelligence, and a measly $1.50. The supplement is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. We're still talking about Black women. The queer Black woman who invented rock and roll. It is as simple as this. What we know as rock and roll did not exist before Sister Rosetta Tharpe. She came before Elvis and Johnny Cash. She preceded Chuck Berry and Little Richard. When most music historians are asked who invented this class of music, many will name one of the previously mentioned rock stars. The most respectful and thoughtful will say it was a combination of these men. But every single one of those men, including Little Richard, will tell you that the first person from whom they heard the sound with which we have become familiar with was Rosetta Tharpe. In his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Johnny Cash said that she was his favorite singer growing up. Little Richard called her his greatest influence. Chuck Berry said that his entire career was just one long Rosetta Tharpe impersonation. A PBS documentary on her life called her the godmother of rock and roll. She is still called the forgotten mother of the genre and the most influential artist ever. In 1963, a collection of Black musicians traveled around the world with the Blues and Gospel Tour. The bill featured artists such as Sonny Terry and Brownie McGhee, Cousin Joe, Otis Spann, and Muddy Waters, all household names in America, but relatively unknown in Europe. In fact, the only venue in the United Kingdom that booked the tour was in Manchester. As their train arrived in Manchester, one of the artists, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, asked the promoter if she could change her opening number to the gospel classic, Didn't It Rain? When she strapped on the guitar and played her unique mix of blues and gospel, it blew the audience's mind and influenced musicians in the area for decades, especially a group who traveled from London in a small bus together. Some dude named Eric Clapton, a kid named Jimmy Page, and members of a very obscure garage band called the Rolling Stones. Maybe she is overlooked because she was technically a gospel singer because rock didn't exist yet, remember? Perhaps Tharpe's blackness was something to do with the fact that she wasn't elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame until 2017. Or was it her queerness? Or the fact that she was a woman? Music authorities argue about a handful of songs recorded between 1946 and 1952 when discussing what might be the first rock and roll song ever, the most popular of which is Rocket 88 by Jackie Preston and his Delta Cats, which was recorded in 1951. Music authorities be lying. It's all Rosetta. Rosetta Newman was born in 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas. By the time she was 6 years old, she was performing in churches around the South with her mother. At that same age, she and her mother moved to Chicago. In 1934, she married a Church of God in Christ preacher named Thomas Tharpe after she became a renowned gospel musician in the COGIC community. That's the what's it? Church of God in Christ. There you go. Rosetta would divorce her husband after a few years, but she kept the surname as her stage moniker. During a time when the idea of guitar playing women was non existent, not only did Rosetta Tharpe erase this line by mastering the symbol of music masculinity, but her blend of gospel and secular music was seen as earth shattering. Her willingness to play God's music in the devil's den of nightclubs and music halls caused an uproar. She was one of the first artists to use heavy distortion on her electric guitar long before the blues artists tried it. After I moved to New York, Tharpe began playing with some of the biggest bands in the country, including Duke Ellington's. By the time she was 23, she had a recording contract and recorded Decca Records' first gospel songs. In October 1938, when Elvis was 3 years old, when Chuck Berry was 12, when Little Richard was 6 years old, and when Jackie Preston and his Delta Cats were still kittens, Sister Rosetta Tharpe recorded, quote, This Train, end quote, a gospel song that would become a mainstream hit. But the other side of that record featured Tharpe playing an electric guitar in a wailing, blues-inspired tempo that no one had ever heard before. The song was called Rock Me. Tharpe's 1945 hit, Strange Things Happening Every Day, was the first gospel record to cross over to the Billboard, quote, race record, end quote, chart, eventually reaching number 2. Strange Things poked fun at religion and opened with a riff that would typify guitar solos a decade later. It became a favorite of Memphis DJ Dewey Phillips and his protege, a little known white dude named Elvis something. The recording is now referred to as a rock and roll record and has been covered by Bruce Springsteen. Even though she was playing venues like Carnegie Hall and the Cotton Club with legendary acts such as Cab Calloway, Tharpe longed to get back to the gospel music circuit. After meeting gospel singer Marie Knight in 1946, Tharpe entered into a relationship with her, and they lived openly as a queer couple until it ended in 1951. And this was major, as Sister Rosetta Tharpe was not an unknown little hidden secret. She was such a huge star that she had her third wedding in a stadium where 25,000 people attended. Yet, with the move to folk music and the British invasion that rejuvenated musicians of her era in the 1960s and 1970s, Tharpe didn't get the same bump that male blues musicians did because she continued to stick to a gospel themed music. She died on October 9, 1973, after suffering a second stroke. Rock and roll did not exist before Rosetta Tharpe, but to say she invented it may be a little presumptuous. Yet she was somehow erased from the history of music. Most reasonable music historians will tell you that one person shouldn't receive credit for an entire genre. While it is true that not every single musician who ever played rock and roll was inspired by Rosetta Tharpe, it is also true that there is not a single rock musician playing in the current era doing something that Rosetta Tharpe wasn't doing 80 years ago. She did it first. Just for the sake of clarity, let's see how Merriam-Webster defines invent. To invent, to produce something such as a useful device or process for the first time through the use of the imagination or of ingenious thinking and experiment. Well, I guess that settles it. Okay, guys, let me go cook my dinner so I can look at the Colorado buffaloes. I'll be back to you within the next couple of days. Enjoy.